King of Podcasts Radio Network proudly presents the Broadcasters Podcast, a weekly media commentary talking about traditional and digital media headlines and talking to the content creators out front and behind the scenes. Here is the King of Podcasts. The ongoing digital disruption in the media industry continues to take shape and continues to make changes overall that this Broadcasters Podcast likes to chronicle on a regular basis. So we're here to go and talk about that. Thank you for listening in and checking out the show. We're going to start things off by going to a collegiate publication, which I do that once in a while when I find a story that comes up and pops up in my search results. We're going to go and take ourselves to Vassar College and the Miscellany News. And a story from Helen Johnson, who writes for these stories there in an op-ed piece. The unprecedented consolidation of the modern media industry has severe consequences. So, the title for tonight's program, Digital Media Marauders Disrupt a Decades-Long Grasp of the Mainstream. Because there's so much going on right now with various disruptors causing the disruption, which has been going on, accelerated by the pandemic. We have chronicled that very much so since the start of this program, when I first titled this show Creative Not Corporate. And the subscription streamers, what they've also been able to go and do, progress or decline. There are some things being said. We want to go and talk about that. They're focusing on, say, an Amazon Prime or a Substack or a TikTok. We're going to go into some of those areas and talk about that. So here we go. The story from Helen Johnson. First of all, she talked about the military-industrial complex and how that is something that was going to be a future of what the media would become. But I don't want to get into that part. What I'll move on is to some of the issues she talks about here. In 1983, there were 50 dominant media corporations. Today, there are 5. These 5 conglomerates own about 90% of the media in the United States, including newspapers, magazines, book publishers, motion picture studios, and radio and television stations. As of 2020, the 5 media giants are AT&T, which own Time Warner, CNN, HBO, and others; Comcast, which owns NBC Universal, Telemundo, and Universal Pictures; Disney, which owns ABC, ESPN, Pixar, and Marvel Studios; News Corp, which owns Fox, Wall Street Journal, and New York Post; and Viacom CBS, which owns CBS and Paramount Pictures, among all their accompanying products and properties. That is everything. That's the mainstream. When we talk about the mainstream of media, it's not how it's talked about in the political sense or in the news sense. This is where we are. And these big corporations, with all that they're going on with, they've been hampered by the pandemic, and they have been gradually declining because of the digital disruption, and have not had a good answer about it. So many of the mergers allowed for the consolidation within the media industry happened after winning antitrust approval from the Justice Department. An extreme lack of regulation regarding media companies has resulted in the media giants managing to secure major holdings in all forms of media, including newspapers, radio and TV stations, and movie studios. There's a new book out called The New Media Monopoly. I got to talk about that. I'm going to look for that book and see if I can find it. Ben Bagdikian writes, quote, that this gives each of the 5 corporations and their leaders more communications power than was exercised by any despot or dictatorship in history. The benefits of consolidation for company owners and shareholders are clear. The fewer the owners, the larger each one's share of the billion-dollar media industry. Additionally, the larger the media giants grow, the more impossible it is for smaller independent outlets to stay afloat. And this is why the digital disruption has been so clear and so dominant. Because the consumer, the media consumer, the watcher, the viewer, the reader, they are willing to go ahead and not deal with the media that consumes 90% of the entire media. There are more people now than not canceling their subscriptions to newspapers, canceling their subscriptions to magazines, cutting their cords for cable, and not even putting on their TV sets to watch what's on network TV through the rabbit ears. Or They're not even turning on their radios. They're using the Bluetooth function on their car radio to go ahead and listen to music or news or talk or whatever, or podcasts. That's where we are. The consolidation of media power extends just beyond mergers and monopolies. The big media giants oftentimes have interlocking directorates, which is why the same people serve on the board of directors in more than one company. According to a study by Aaron Moore in the Columbia Journalism Review in 2003, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, and Time Warner had 45 interlocking directors. Very interesting here. I like that Helen put all this effort into the story because it really does encompass the state of the digital disruption. This whole story about media and how corporate it is and how lack of creativity there is. Why we see so many rehashed, retooled, remade projects. Because in a corporate system, you just work with what has worked in the past without having to do anything new. And there's no real competition in between. But there is now with the digital disruption, and they're not doing a good job against it. No analysis of the concentration of media power and the corporations that control today's messaging would be complete without a close look at big tech and the internet. The huge tech companies of today have produced another form of power concentration and broadened the reach of major media conglomerates. Because of the internet, today's news media reaches more Americans than ever before, while being controlled by the smallest number of owners in history. But people are staying away from news. I think there's more people that you can see that are not watching news. Since the conclusion of the 2020 election, we've seen a significant drop in viewership among network and cable news outlets. And I don't even need to go and talk about the amount of layoffs and people that have been let go from newspapers, publications, websites, and whatnot. Unlike the conglomerates like AT&T, Comcast, Disney, etc., tech companies don't produce the content we see. They control what we view. The market power of platforms like Google and Facebook is obscene, combining for over 70% of user-restricted websites of major news publishers. But the difference with Facebook and Google is that, sure, they have their own news outlets, their own news aggregation. But that doesn't mean that people cannot go ahead and share and learn other content. Things are going on where it's very grassroots. And among what you will look for on Google, you can still find local stories. You can find stories. I found this story from miscellaneousnews.org about this particular story. So I'm looking for other stories. And so I keep looking out there to find what there is that will actually fit more of what I'm looking for. Now, the implications of the extreme consolidation of media power are extensive. First, the largest source of political money comes from corporations. The media conglomerates are some of the largest corporations in the world. In the Forbes 2020 ranking of the world's largest public companies, AT&T came in 11th, Comcast 27th, Disney 36th. Viacom, CBS, and News Corp trail the top three. And tech companies are also at the top of the list. Alphabet, or Google's parent company, is 13th in the world. Facebook, 39th. And the market value of all these companies range from $5.8 to $919 billion. These billions upon billions equal more influence in political discourse in elections. That makes sense. It's going to happen. Money determines the winning issues and candidates in American politics. So larger the corporation, the stronger the influence. But no other industry is as linked to voting patterns as the media industry. Their product is the messaging that dictates the issues and candidates that dominate the national arena. So I'm going to move past that part of the political side. This is the law that I will continue to reiterate over and over. This is what destroyed radio as it was, and what has destroyed a lot of media in the cable spectrum. You want to talk about one of the first blows was the FCC's, the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Amending the Communications Act of 1934, the first major overhaul of telecommunications law in over 60 years. According to the FCC, the goal of the law was to let anyone enter any communications business, to let any communications business compete in any market against any other. This is actually a response to the internet. The legislation deregulated the broadcasting and telecommunications markets. The media giants benefited immensely from this, and it lobbied extensively for its passage, which is why it should come as no surprise that major news outlets completely failed to cover the legislation. Right. At the time, nobody talked about it. But when I saw radio making its change and all the radio stations being purchased by different conglomerates, it would be the idea that there were certain smaller middle market and station owners that started gobbling up stations because somebody was going to come in and pick them all up, which is what Chancellor Media did, AM/FM radio networks, J-Core Broadcasting. I can name others. And they sold, and Paxson Communications, and most importantly, because then they were able to go and sell their stations to Clear Channel and allow Clear Channel to get over 1,000 radio stations around the country when they're of their 7,000 stations in general. But they were able to get up over 1,000 of the top radio stations with the largest reach, the biggest market share, the biggest cumes, and the strongest signals. Concentrated media power not only affects which issues take spotlight in the news, but their power in the entire realm of politics. The consequences of concentrated political influence among the media conglomerates is far more reaching still. So Helen goes along and talks more about the political end, talks about Fox News, things like that. I'm going to conclude here. Media giants are not only global corporations themselves, but are invested in other million and billion-dollar industries. They are not standalone companies with isolated interests. Media conglomerates make up money off of advertising, which holds influence over reporting and broadcasting. Beyond even this, however, the media giants have physical and financial ties to other industries, interlocking directorates, revolving doors of personnel, and financial stakes and holdings connect the corporate media to the state, the Pentagon, defense and arms manufacturers, and the oil industry. Our free press, which assures, quote, government by the consent of the governed, end quote, is embedded with the captains of industry and profiteers of war. It's a lot of power to give. But I'm not concerned about, I mean, you listen, power corrupts absolutely. But to have so much of it, I mean, there are big corporate companies that they do good. I mean, in terms of, you know, you have businesses that thrive very well in a corporate system. To run something that's going to be nationwide or global, sure. But we don't need all these media industries to be the same thing. We don't need radio, television, music, and movies to all be run by large conglomerates. There has to be room for both. And that's what makes it great. But we don't have that right now. And this will be a story that I think if I could have had to talk about this back when I first started this program in 2018, it would have been something to really follow up on. Because it was absolutely true. When you think about it, all the things that have happened here that have affected the overall scope of the industry in general. You look at what's going on with the subscription streamers that are run and operated by the corporate types. They are recreating, rehashing, retooling, and resurrecting old programming. What else can they do? They're letting shows run longer than they probably would need to be running. And it's a lot to be said about this digital disruption because now the competition's in play. Your consumers are now locked at a point of, first of all, convenience. Being able to go and have apps of all their favorite programming in one place. So if they need to go and have a device or a platform like a Amazon Fire, Roku, Chromecast TV, Apple TV, whatever, to have everything all in one place. We have those in place now. But then, how many of these apps are people willing to go ahead and pay premium for? With a smartphone, there might be a handful of apps that people might subscribe to, but there's not that many. And then, really, depending on how much time you have to be at home, or how much time you would use this in a regular basis, because people have busy lives, you got to think about the fact that there's a lot of different options that are out there where there's only so much money that's going to go around. And that you can't use nostalgia forever. There has to be a future plan. Disney Plus has done so. But they have also really raped and pillaged their entire roster of programming, or all of their brands, to be able to create programming for the next 3 years. Will they be able to go ahead and continue to recreate and keep the same buzz and excitement and hype? Or will they lose their spot altogether? That's a hard question to answer. Takes me to my next story. And it is one of the overlying factors that is a consequence of this digital disruption, for everything to be piecemealed into separate subscriptions. People have gone ahead and cut the cable cord and decided we're not going to be beholden to a cable box anymore. But then all these companies, they also are able to own the properties to be able to go and continue to provide customers with internet access. And they can also move their content to an online platform so they can be able to go and continue to use it and just eliminate the cable boxes once they're finally done. So Vox.com put a story out last week after I recorded the podcast, how subscriptions took over our lives. Terry Nguyen writes, on platforms like Substack and Patreon, subscriptions can be emotional purchases, but others like Amazon Prime feel more like utilities. They talked to one person that subscribed to Netflix back in the 2010s. She, along with her sister, diversified their offerings to be able to go ahead and get the best of everything. So, for instance, together, they subscribed to Spotify, Hulu, HBO, Amazon Prime, Funimation, the anime-centric service, and they also had subscriptions increased to more direct donations to creators. Spending over 11 subscriptions, about $120 per month, from streaming services to Substacks to artist Patreon accounts. $120 per month. Wow. That is the extreme end of people subscribing for all these services. Which, when you think about it, that means it's not much less of a bargain than it is cable. And are people willing to go ahead and say, well, that's okay, we'll continue just to go ahead and buy this because it's the same price as cable. Maybe a little bit more. But a good cable plan, it costs that much. It's not the highest end of the cable package, but it's pretty close. The monthly $5, $10, and $15 credit line charges add up. When the subscription business model was pioneered by news publishers in the 17th century, there was little competition. Within the past 2 decades, all sorts of businesses have begun clamoring for a slice of the subscriber pie. And we saw it early on. Consumer product startups, retailers like Dollar Shave Club, to media organizations, and internet personalities. A few major players have been so integral to people's buying or streaming patterns, like Netflix or Amazon Prime, that consumers approached them as a sort of utility. Looking at a subscription landscape that included media, the global consulting firm McKinsey separated subscriptions into 2 general categories: direct-to-consumer box services, which is like weekly meal kits or monthly coffee deliveries, and streaming media subscriptions. Now, this person that bought up to $120 a month in subscription, said, quote, "To me, paying for someone's Substack or Patreon seems more impactful than it does to pay for Netflix and have 1,000 movies. I'm someone who cares about the arts, and I feel like I have a responsibility to spread this money around and allow people to earn a living by making their art." She plans to reevaluate her subscription budget once the normal life resumes, but likely will keep most of the Substack and Patreon subscriptions she has accrued. And then they talk about the possible idea of subscription fatigue. In this story, they say Netflix has been tolerating freeloaders. In 2016, long before Disney Plus, Apple TV Plus, Showtime, Discovery Plus, and the streaming wars, its CEO dismissed password sharing as a concern. And now they've hinted at an end to shared accounts by testing a feature requiring users to verify their access via text or email. And this is coming at a time when most people are overwhelmed by the options of streaming subscription services foisted upon them. More than half of the 2,000 respondents to Deloitte's Digital Media Trend Survey in 2021 expressed frustration towards subscribing to multiple services to access the content they want. But increasingly, streaming platforms are being bundled into various deals offered by mega media conglomerates, which I also can't stand. When I look at any kind of service, let's say it's AAA, or if it's PayPal, or if it's, there's a number of different services, then they will go ahead and offer bundles or discounts or some kind of an affiliate program embedded in your cell phone service in the same way. I remember when Verizon did that, but of course they were kind of crappy because it'd give you like a 6-month subscription, which you would forget to go ahead and cancel renewing if you would just wanted to watch it for a while or listen to something for a while, and then you would get dinged for it. Disney Plus, I tried that. I also tried Apple Music for a while on the 6-month subscription, and then I got out of there. But that's the freemium style, and some people are willing to go through that. Quarantine delayed the inevitable streaming fatigue, instead leading many Americans to renew or add more entertainment subscriptions. Netflix adding 15.8 million subscribers in the first quarter of 2020. Disney Plus for the year 2020 hit 50 million subscribers, doubling subscriptions between February and April. And Netflix has dropped off a little bit, but we knew that was going to happen. Henry Jacobs, a media scholar and professor at the University of USC, Southern California, says, quote, "The streaming wars are going to depend on franchises, if not name brands that people recognize, trust, or rely on," which is where the corporate end comes from. Take your existing brands, franchises, and models and run them to the ground. Real Life Magazine's Drew Austin wrote, quote, "Content is still a commodity, inherently shaped by the platforms that circulate it and responsive to their incentives, monetary or otherwise. Rather than overthrowing the corporate entertainment industry, the internet has led us to internalize that industry's logic, precipitating what is often called the creator economy." Now, there's also more from that Deloitte survey that I just prefaced, a generational gap with what younger and older consumers are willing to subscribe to. More Gen Z consumers rank playing video games, streaming music, and using social media above watching movies and TV shows as their favorite entertainment activity. I mentioned on the show, and I mentioned it in a When I'm Not Podcasting episode, that you have millennials and Gen Zs are now watching more TikTok than they're watching television. Well, we are. So these are the kind of things that people need to consider of what is changing everything. The whole game is changing right now. And that's where people need to have the understanding. See what's going on. It's a lot to be said. That's why I want to go and leave it at that. I'm going to leave it all right there tonight because it's just a simple message that I wanted to put out. Plus, there wasn't a whole lot to go bring up in the news, so we'll leave it short tonight. But I appreciate all of you checking in, listening to the program as you always do. And if there's anything you want to always talk about here on the program, please go ahead and reach out to me, kingofpodcasts@yahoo.com. Again, kingofpodcasts@yahoo.com. We'll leave it there. Keep it short tonight. And until next week, remember that content is king, and the control of your content is in your hands.
Thank you for listening to the Broadcasters Podcast. Find all the links to subscribe to the show by going to broadcasterspodcast.com. And don't forget to check out the King of Podcasts wrestling program, the Wrestling is Real podcast, exclusively at wrestlingisreal.com.